Welcome to the Why God Why podcast episode. We exist to respond to the questions you don't feel comfortable asking in church. And we are brought to you by the Lumavaz Network out of Saddleback Church. I am here with our remarkable producer, Nathan Yoder, and my fantastic friend and co-host, Aaron Mercer.
Thanks, Peter. It's good to be on with you. By the way, we're looking very, I know this isn't Christmas time, but we look very Christmassy today for some reason. I don't know.
Well, you know, we should celebrate Christmas every day.
There you go. All right.
Oh, boom. Anyways, what a great way to start. We are asking the question, why can't we get along with our neighbors of other races? We're very excited to have author and professor Dr. George Yancey. He recently published the book Beyond Racial Division. As always, we're thankful for Krista Clayton from InterVarsity Press. 2 weeks starting after this podcast, you have a 2-week window to buy this book with a 30% discount by using Why God. And we're just really, we've kind of been on a journey on this podcast in talking about racial reconciliation, and to have George back on again. He was talking with us about politics during our last election, so he just kind of signs up for all the tough episodes.
Well, I'm really thankful for this opportunity, Dr. Yancey. I'll try to call you George. I know it's hard though, because I'm talking to a professor. I don't know if I could do it or not, but I'll try. But I really appreciate you being on this conversation with us. And I know you were on the Why God Why podcast a while back, but it was really before I'd started doing a lot of these with Peter. And I've read about you, but I'd love to hear some more of your story. Maybe our listeners would too, just to hear how you, where you came from, how you got to this place, and how you got to wanting to write this book.
Sure. So, I've been talking about racial issues for I'm trying to say whether it's 2 or 3 decades. I think it's 3 decades, so I'm old. But I really spent, about 2010, I decided that I didn't want to write about race anymore or do research on it. I wanted to study other things. I didn't get back into it till about 2020. And of course, it was George Floyd, it was Arbery, maybe it was the pandemic. But I think God worked within me to really want to get back into this. And I guess part of it is my driving force is the question I ask is, does my Christian faith have something to say about race that you don't see otherwise or easily see otherwise? And I came to the conclusion, yes, it does. But I don't see Christians doing it. So I just want to, say, hey, we don't have to do what the rest of the world does on racial issues. We can do something different, something that's more effective, that works. And so that's been sort of where I'm at today.
I love when you kind of paint a picture for us. Usually we don't jump this direct, but why don't you paint a picture for our listeners about how you're processing through being a follower of Jesus, how that relates to racism, and what you just talked about there, because that's pretty powerful, and I think we should kind of sit with that as you kind of process for our listeners.
Okay, so, I guess in one sense, my understanding of race really happened in grad school. At the University of Texas, very secular, so it wasn't like a lot of deep biblical thinking, but in grad school, I learned about a more secular mindset in the Enlightenment movement and in today, where we as humans have the power to create some version of paradise. And you can see in the works of Marx and some of the other, Enlightenment thinkers that were out there, that we, if we use reason, rationality, we will figure it all out and we'll create paradise. And as a Christian, when I was learning this, I was like, wait, that's not what I believe. And in fact, I think the evidence shows otherwise, that humans are not capable of creating paradise. I don't even have to go to the Bible. I mean, you can look at group interest theory. You can look at ethnocentrism. You can look at, confirmation bias, how we tend to create societies that work for us and not against other people. And so, at that point, I saw a fundamental difference between Christianity and humanism. And and why this pertains to race. So when I dived into studying race, when I got involved into really wanting to deal with something with race, that perspective came to my mind. And it occurs to me, what we so often see in our society is this group or that group says, look, you do what we say, and that deals with racism. That's the same perspective of, hey, we can create paradise. Rather, what I think God wants us to do is to learn from each other, because we all have our narrow-mindedness, our fallacies, the way we see things. And we learn from each other. We can build on each other's ideas. And yeah, it'd be great if God just came down and said, hey, I want you to do A, B, C, and D. But I think there's a reason why God doesn't do that. I think God knows that if that was taking place, then what will happen is I have the answers, you do A, B, C, and D, and you follow me. And rather, we need to learn from each other. And I think that that's just missing today in our racial discussion. It's, I have the answers, you need to do what I say, or what my group of people say, and then we solve racial problems. I don't think they get solved that way. I think they get solved when we can have what I now call collaborative conversations with one another, where we build on each other's ideas, and that's goal-oriented, that finds solutions. I think that's how we get past this. I don't think we get past this any other way.
You mentioned you had been talking about this for a number of decades, and then, really wanted to get talking about it a lot more, especially in recent years. And I know you just mentioned the importance of having group conversations about racial matters, about racial division. Some of these really tough issues our country has been dealing with for a long time, but in particular the last several years, it's been accentuated. I'm curious what, as you have seen, I felt like there was a period of time when there were a lot of conversations that were happening, especially in 2020 and 2021. What have you seen come out of those? And I'm also curious, do you think that those conversations are still going strong, or is this something that is cooling and it shouldn't? I mean, what's your perspective on that?
I think there's been a lot of talk about racial issues. Well, I don't think there's been a lot of productive conversations on racial issues. There's been a lot of people who talk to others and tell them what they want to do, rather than talk to others, listen to others, and try to build on each other's ideas. I think there's been a dearth of that when it comes to racial issues. So yeah, there's a lot of talk, but look at the nature of the talk. I remember seeing articles, here's what white people need to do. We're in by a black person, or, from white person, why do black people keep talking about race? So that's not having conversations. So there's been talk, but has there really been conversations? And I think there's not been enough conversation.
Do you think that there are terms that, what's getting in the way of I totally resonate with you about talking about, there's lots of people, I feel like this is in the social media age too. There's a lot of people who just talk past each other a lot and maybe aren't listening very much. And for a conversation, you need both speaking and listening. What's getting in the way of that? Is it just people are dug in, or are people using words that each other don't understand? What's the disconnect?
Yeah, I don't know if it's a lack of understanding, to be honest. I think people do use words and they use them differently, but I think people kind of know how people are using the words today. So I would not say it's a lack of understanding per se. I would argue that it's probably more the formal, that people who, the ones who are talking about race have a perspective, and they're sort of, as you say, dug in on it. Now, there's probably about half the country is not talking about it and don't want to, in part because they don't want to get involved with the crossfire. If we create an environment where people could talk and have conversations, I think we can bring more people into the conversation. But the ones who are talking, we know the format. You get someone on MSNBC or Fox or CNN, and you get, if either you get everyone who's on a certain side of an issue and they just feed each other, or you set up this sort of debate, which is really not a conversation, which is, people trying to score points on each other. And you bring in social media. I think you see the same thing in social media. how often on social media do people post stuff to score points, to attack the others? And how much do they post stuff because they want to bring a new idea or a nuance and have discussions? And I think if we're honest, it's a lot more of the former and not enough of the latter. And I think that's part of what gets in our way.
So paint us a picture of building on ideas of an issue where you'd love to see that happen in conversation.
Okay, so almost any racialized issue, it could be that. I mean, we could talk about immigration. What are we going to do about immigration? Are we going to make it this political football? I would even say that we kind of know what the solution is going to be, both on the left and the right. We know the solution is probably going to be some form of path to legalization or citizenship for people who are already here, some sort of strong borders, whether it's a wall or not, I think is immaterial, but some sort of strong borders. I think that's going to be the solution. Now, I'm not saying that's my solution. I think that's the solution that people are going to be able to do, but we don't get there because we rather score points. So I think immigration is a good issue where I think we kind of know. We could look at how do we teach about race in our high schools and junior highs. When people are arguing CRT, I don't even going into are they defined correctly or not. How are we going to teach about race in a way that people can come to agreement on and build on each other's ideas rather than, we're going to fight over CRT or we're going to fight over this, we're going to fight over that. There's nothing wrong with disagreeing. Don't hear me saying disagreement is wrong. I'm saying that the fight just for score points, that's what our problem is. So, almost any racial issue you can think of, what are we going to do about voting rights? How are we going to manage the competing interests on different sides of issues? Any racial issue, we could have a good discussion if we decide to. But if we're dug in on our position, say we're not going to move, we're not going to compromise, then that is the problem.
If there's a community that really wants to, to have a good conversation, to actually seek some sort of understanding, hopefully healing, what would you suggest? Where should they start? What is a good topic? Or topic doesn't sound like the right word, but what is the issue that they should talk about first, and listen first on whatever side, or even not a side, just maybe coming at it from not knowing anything. What should they be talking about first?
Well, I think the issue that is most pressing on whatever that community's mind is where they should start. And I think they should start with a single issue, not try to solve everything at once, because what happens when you're in a relationship or a friendship and you try to solve everything at once is you solve nothing because you jump from one issue to another. So I think they need to focus in on. So that may be in a school setting. That may be, how we're going to teach U.S. history. Maybe something as simple as that. If we're looking at communities, they may be, what are we going to do about policing in communities of color, of communities that are people who are marginalized. It could be in our government. What are we going to do with our government as far as trying to mitigate the historical effects of racism in people of color? Are we going to create something akin to affirmative action or something that is affirmative action light or a different method? How are we going to meet these different needs? So I think that the issue is less important. I think the issue is important in that it's something that has to be pertinent to that community. But I think it's less about the issue and more about how do we learn how to discuss these issues. So what we're really missing is we have not learned how to have these discussions in constructive ways. We've learned how to score points. We learned how to have arguments, how to have debates, but not how to have constructive conversations. And I think that is the key. I think we get that right, then the issue becomes secondary. We'll get to the other issues eventually. So I'd rather you start off with the wrong issue, but discuss that better than the right issue and do what we've been doing in the past. So the issue to me is important, but it's secondary to how do we have conversations that are productive rather than destructive.
So the subtitle of your book, Beyond Racial Division, talks about how colorblindness and anti-racism are incomplete solutions. So I think this is helpful for our listeners. How are these two issues related and disrelated? And then kind of landing on that subtitle, just process for our listeners, because they'll hear those two ideas and both sides of those issues will come in, both people, whether they look at it positive or negatively, but just kind of give your view, because I think that subtitle is pretty powerful for where we're at.
Okay, so I think it's pretty clear on how they disagree. I mean, colorblindness says don't focus on race at all. Anti-racism says, race. I mean, the anti-racists basically argue that race is foundational in the United States, and so we have to focus on racism. That it is, that is multifaceted, that's pervasive, and so we have to focus in on it. So, and the solutions are going to be very disparate. Obviously, when your solution is, hey, ignore racism versus, hey, we got to really focus in on all this multifaceted, pervasive racism, you have different solutions. And so I think that the differences are pretty clear. What people don't realize is that there's a similarity. And the similarity is this. Both the colorblindness and the anti-racist, both of them say, we're the solution, you do what we say, and we solve racism. And both of them are very proactive. And I think that the anti-racism people will see it more clearly on how proactive it is. We see anti-racism this, and we see, we're going to do anti-racism that. So I don't think I have to make the case for that. The colorblindness, people tend to think, well, colorblindness is just, ignore race and just leave us alone. So about 2 years now, I was on Facebook and I was talking, I have three boys, very young boys. And I was talking about, as an African-American, raising boys who are interracially married, but raising boys who could be perceived of as men of color. How do I talk to them about dealing with the police and how do I approach dealing with racism? And I just put that out there for other people who are raising kids of color, be they a person of color or not. And what I got, while I got some advice, what I got was a lot of pushback from some of my white friends who are saying, why are you even bringing up race? You should be ignoring race and raise them to be good Christian men and ignore the race. Now, here's what's interesting. What they were doing was not just saying to themselves, look, I'm going to raise my kid to be colorblind and that's good. They're saying, I should raise my kid to be colorblind. This is, when you think about how intrusive that is, that's saying, hey, it's not enough for me to raise my kid. Everyone else has to raise their kids to be colorblind. Colorblindness is also intrusive. It's also saying, you do what we say and we solve racism. So in that way, they're both similar in that they're both built on the Enlightenment idea that we can create utopia as humans. And we can figure out the solutions and then impose those solutions on other individuals. And that they really are the same, even though they come to very different answers as to what those solutions will be.
So let me kind of come back to that Facebook question. Aaron and I are parents. We'll just talk specifically of me. I have two daughters at the recording of this podcast. They're both about to have birthdays. They're going to be 2 and 5. As somebody that studies sociology and anthropology, this is what you do. What encouragement for me would you give on even kind of starting conversations, about this? Because I think it's important, because at one point, my daughter's probably going to come back from school and talk about an issue. How would you encourage parents? I think it's pretty powerful just to hear your perspective on that.
Yeah. So, when it comes to the parenting, so your kids are 2 and 5, so they're a little bit younger than mine. My kid, my oldest is 7, my second is 6, and the baby is 4. So parenting is a challenge, as you well know. Anyone with kids know parenting is a challenge, and a challenge on many fronts. And of course, the racial front is one of them. So here's what my wife and and I don't say this as an expert, even though I study this stuff. When it comes to parenting, I'm a novice like everyone else. This is the first time I've had a 7-year-old. And next year, the first time I had an 8-year-old, and that sort of thing. So different challenges, all that sort of stuff. You think you know how to parent until you become a parent. It's that sort of thing. So I always hesitate to give parents advice. There's not a lot of great research out there, from my point of view, on how you raise kids in a way that I would want my kids to be raised on racial issues. So I'll just give you a couple of things that we're doing, and you can take it for what it is. First thing we're doing is we're exposing our kids, our boys, to racial issues. Now, what we're not doing is we're not sitting them down and going, hey, blacks cannot vote reasonably until the 1960s and 70s. We're not going all into slavery, although they will read some books that contain some of that in there. But we're taking them. We just took them a couple of weeks ago to MLK walk and such. I won't say it's a protest, but it was a walk and celebration in a sense. We'll take them to Juneteenth. The topic will come up, and we'll discuss the topic. We did have this book. It was a cool book that had no words, but it showed a girl hiding a runaway slave. And so we let the conversation come up naturally. We don't try to force it on them, but we expose them to it so that it will come up. And so I think that's a way we want to do that. As it comes up, then we try to put our values into our boys. We try to discuss, we discuss the reality of race, what happened in the past. We've not gotten to really discussing, because they're still young, about institutionalized or structural forms of racialized society and how they may impact people. I think we will get to that, but at 7, he's not ready for that yet. But we're exposing them to that. The other thing that I think that we're doing, which once again, this is trial and error for us, and I think this is going to help them in a lot of phases of life. We used to, when there was conflict, step in, adjudicate the conflict, and decide who was right and who was wrong. And there are times in which you have to do that. When one boy hits another boy, there's no, hey, you have to address the violence. And then if there's something else, then you address that. But that has to be addressed first. But as much as possible, what we want to do is have the boys work it out together. And the reason why we want to do this is we want them to learn the skills of how to take into consideration someone else's perspective and find solutions that everyone can live with. And so we're getting better at it, and they're getting better at it. They sometimes they can't find. A lot of times they find solutions. They're arguing over toys and who has what. And rather than saying, okay, you're going to have this, you're going to have that, we ask them to work it out. And at first it seems like it's kind of lazy. You're a parent, you should go in and you should, go ahead and parent. But actually, it is working out because we're giving them principles. We're say, hey, have you thought about what he needs? And how can we make this fair for everyone? Everyone seems fair. I think that my hope is over time, when racial conflict emerges, these same skills that they will have to adjudicate it, to look at the perspective of others and to find solutions that everyone can live with will come to the forefront. And not just on racial issues, but on other issues. So we're hoping that in doing this, we're making them not just better on racial issues, but ideally better fathers in one day, better husbands, better friends, better workers. We're hoping to do that with them. And so that's kind of where we're at. It'll change, obviously, as they get older and get into the preteens and teens, and then we'll deal with some deeper issues. I will say that my 7-year-old has read books that Little House on the Prairie books, and those books are surprisingly very racialized. There was one book where the father put on blackface. Because this book was written a long time ago, but blackface and performed. And so my wife, she talked to him about what that is and what that meant and how that's offensive and things of that nature. And so, just reading old literature, we'll get to some of these racialized issues as we read to our kids. We just have to make sure that we don't, obviously there's some things that you don't want your kids to have it. They're not ready for it. And so I'm not saying give them everything. And I don't want them to watch the movie Amistad, for example, or something like that. There are things that that's too intense for them, and your kids, and so, but you can't shelter them from all of don't shelter them from the ugliness of racism and what's happened historically, as well as how it may play itself out today. And just expose them to it and just let the conversation go. That's, once again, I don't say this as an expert. I say this as someone trying to discover it as I go. And maybe when I figure this all out, I'll write a book on raising our kids to engage in collaborative conversations and to deal with race. But right now, I'm just trying to figure it out myself. I got to figure out my kids first before I write that book.
Well, thank you for sharing that. And I just want to jump off Peter's question, actually, and what you just shared. You were talking about if a child, if someone's kid comes and sees something at school, or who knows what causes the question to come up, whether it's a book or something else, and or something that's on TV or whatever. But let's say, so you mentioned earlier, there's lots of talking going on, not a lot of conversation. And then there's a whole bunch of people who are just not in the conversation because either they don't know about it, they're oblivious to it, or maybe they're worried, they just don't want to get involved because it's, tense, and there's a lot of arrows being shot back and forth. But let's say there's a community. I'm going to turn this towards like a church setting now. Like, let's say that, and I don't want to say that there's like a violent issue. Let's leave it. That definitely is a catalyst. Unfortunately, it's very sad. But let's get to some of the other things that sometimes will catalyze conversations. There's a church community, and there's there's a debate within the community over a curriculum, maybe at the school board or something like that. Where it's not the intensity of a violent situation, but there's definitely passions there. How can a church or some Christian community, they know that the people in their community are seeing this, and it's definitely firing emotions up, and people might not know what to do with that. They might not know what everything means. How does a church engage that, or how does a Christian community engage that in a productive way? Where do people start if they want to have if they want to engage the conversation?
Yeah. So, I think ideally what a church should be doing, and what I want to try to help churches to do, and I'm trying to work on some material to help churches do, is have the conversation before we get to the controversy. And so if the church is already in conversations with people of different racial groups and collaboratively trying to figure out why people believe what they believe, curious about how people come to these conclusions, then when the controversy happens, it's not as big of I didn't know they were thinking like that. How could they think this way? You may not agree with them, but you know why they're thinking the way they are. And so I think that, that's the first starting point. But if you're not done that and the controversy happens, you could, a church could create a space and teach people how to have productive conversations, and then let people understand why people want, certain discourses taught in school, or why people are afraid of those discourses, and not go back to stereotypes or recriminations or things of this nature. I think that the church can create a space for that, and then within their own body. Now, what does it mean as far as the school board meeting or something like that? I think that we Christians have to get our own house in order first. I'm hesitant about Christians going. If you feel called to go and protest something, okay. But I'm hesitant to say, hey, this is how we're going to express our racial concerns right now until we figured out how we can have better conversations. Then we have something to teach people. But if we're taking sides and just taking the talking points of one side or another and just going to a school board meeting, then we're not offering anything that they can't get from anywhere else. And so what good are we? So I think that it's better for us to get our own house in order, to learn how we have these productive conversations first. And then we can go and we can be the light to the world. And so that's kind of where what I would like to see happen in the Christian community. What
is the ideal target for what should a church or some other Christian community, but whether it's Christian neighbors or whatever, but let's just say a church, what should be the goal? What's the ideal that they're trying to get to, that then they can have something productive to say to the rest of the community? But what are they aiming for amongst themselves?
I think what they're aiming for is, how can we discuss racialized problems and find solutions where we bring everyone together? So, what I advocate is, active listening, effective communication, try to find solutions that bring in the concerns of other people and see if you can come to consensus. Learning that process, I think, would be valuable. And so that when something comes up, rather than jump to one side or another, we active listening, productive communication, learning how to find a solution that brings in other individuals. We'll already have that down. We'll already know how to do that. Even though the problem may switch and change, and some are more difficult than others, we'll already have an insight as to how we can do that. So I think the goal, if a church is just engaging in this conversation for the sake of it, is to learn how to solve problems, how to engage in conversations that solve problems, rather than just argue with one another. I think that is a worthy goal at this point in time.
As we kind of think about the Christian kind of view to kind of engaging some of the issues that we've talked about, I think about Galatians 3:28, and I just want to read it, and then I kind of want you to respond to it. Galatians 3:28 says this: Paul is writing to this church that's dealing with Jews and Gentiles, and there's some problems there. And he says this: there is neither Jew nor Gentile, neither slave nor free, nor is there male and female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus. So just as a pastor, because I've had to preach on this passage, I just want to kind of say this and kind of, it's funny because some people will focus on just you're all in Christ, and other people will focus on the fact that Paul calls out these individuals and identifies them. But really, I think the power of this passage is kind of to your principle of building things together. Yes, you're created in the image of God. Yes, everybody's level at the foot of the cross, but each of you has different experiences. And so we're not afraid to identify those experiences. And I think that that's the vision that Paul and Christianity is giving, that I can see how we're being brought together, but I can also understand the experiences and differences of people. I don't know. What would you add to that? Do you disagree or agree with that?
Yeah, I'm sorry, you did cut out a little bit in there, but I think I got the gist of the question. The way I see that passage is what I think Paul is saying is that everyone is an image bearer, and no matter what your status is in there. So everyone's an image bearer. And I think that it has profound implications as to how we treat people. Because one of the implications, which is a challenge, is if everyone's an image bearer, then no one has to do anything to earn my love. They're image bearing Christ, and therefore I should love them no matter what they do. So this is really a basis for agape love. That it also means that I should be concerned with what concerns them, even if it doesn't concern me, even if it's not something that I particularly care about. If they care about it and if it's impacting them, I should care about it. And so to me, this really changes not just race, but just how we should be approaching one another and how we should be treating one another. It's impossibly polarized, I believe, if I see everyone as an image bearer, because I may disagree with them. They may not appreciate what I'm trying to do for them, because they may say, well, that's not how I experience love. And that's fine. But my goal should be, how can I do what's best for them? How can I love them the best? And so, and I think that this is part of my approach towards collaborative conversations, because if I'm trying to find a solution for me and my group, and I don't care what happens to your group as long as my group is taken care of, then that's not a Christian solution. It can't be a Christian solution. A Christian solution has to take into consideration what other people want. And to know what that is, what they think is important, I have to engage in a conversation with them where I understand where they're coming from. where I accurately perceive their needs and try my best to help try to meet those needs. Doesn't mean that I throw away my needs. Does not mean that at all. It means that I try to find a way that I can, and this is what I'm trying to teach my boys. Can you find a way that you're still happy and they're happy too? Because that's sustainable. Then they play a long time. But if one of them is not happy, he's going to create havoc. And then, there's always an argument. And of course, you all know this, that there's not peace in the house when the boys are arguing all the time, or the kids are arguing all the time. And so, but if everyone is satisfied, even if they don't get everything they want, they're satisfied, then we have peace and people are happy. That should be where we're at. Unfortunately, we're not that way a lot of times. We think that the goal is to maximize what we can get for us or our group. And that passage it should kill that sort of idea that we're all image bearers, and therefore, no matter where you're at, I should care about you deeply.
What's you mentioned the kids. There's no peace in the house when the kids are arguing, and sure, that I think we all know that. Sometimes the battles that are going on, even in that scenario with kids, they're arguing over something, but there might be other things that are feeding that. Maybe they didn't get enough sleep the night before or something. There could be something else that's not being spoken. Maybe that they're not even aware of, and as parents we might be aware of. But what have you found? And so some of these conversations, maybe conversations that have been productive that you've seen, people who are really trying to get beyond racial division. What are some of the things simmering under the surface that people don't originally want to talk about, or maybe don't even know that they don't want to talk about, that you have to get to in order to start having not just talking, but a productive conversation? What have you found?
Yeah. So in the social sciences, there's something called confirmation bias. And I think that that's a lot of what drives a lot of it. And confirmation bias, I believe, is driven by ethnocentrism. So for the way I see it, it works like this. So I want something for me or for my group or something like that. That desire is there. I'm not saying it's sinful in and of itself, but it could be an obsession where, it could turn into greed, obviously. So I want something, but I have to justify it. It's not enough for me to say, look, I want this, therefore I have that, because I know that in society that's not good enough. So confirmation bias, so that's ethnocentrism. Confirmation bias is our tendency to look at ideas and data and evidence that we like in a more favorable light and so we emphasize the information that conforms to what we believe or what we want, and we de-emphasize the one that doesn't. And I use this sort of as an example in my classes. I'm not talking about confirmation bias, but I think it's a good illustration for that. So if you're following a sports team and they're playing basketball, and the guy drives in the lane, another guy gets in the way, and they run to each other. Whether it's a charge or whether it's a blocking foul depends on confirmation bias a lot of times. And when we all done this, when our team's in defense, we're looking for all the evidence that was a charge. When our team's on offense, we'll look at all the evidence is blocking. And so we want to say the refs, have not been good to us, because we want to justify that they're ripping us off. Unless we get the call that we want, then the refs, of course, are great. That's confirmation bias in a fun sense. But we do that with our political views. We do that with our religious views too, to be honest. It's hard to get away from confirmation bias. I think that this is an underlying thing. And so when people discuss, I was just reading something from Kendi, and Kendi was talking about the January 6th riots versus the riots or information in 2020, all the protests, and some of them turned into riots. And so the first thing he said was, 93% of that and I don't know where he gets his numbers, but 93% of the 2020 protests were peaceful. There's only 7%. And of that 7%, a lot of that was the police being violent, not the protesters being violent. Now, that's kind of convenient because that doesn't I'm not trying to defend either one, but what percentage of the people on January 6th who were there for the rally were violent? Was it 7% or more? We don't know. Kenny leaves out that information. And I'm not picking on Kenny because he's anti-racist. I'm just saying that we all do this. How do you know that a lot of the 7% was police initiated? What's that based on? Is it based on anecdotal evidence or is it based on something systematic? How do you know that from my point, from what I've heard, there's police violence in January 6th. The police shot a woman down. What percentage of that was police initiated? We don't know. So we do this. We focus in on the information that makes our point look good, and we ignore other information. I don't know whether Kenny's right or not. I don't know whether or not, just based on what he's saying, I don't know whether or not as a percentage of violence that January 6th is more violent than 2020. I don't know. But I can't go on what he says because he's leaving out information. Whereas as a scholar, I'm taught to, and this happens among scholars too, but I'm taught to, ask questions such as, I can't just say it's 93% was peaceful and January 6th was more violent unless I have some information on January 6th. That sort of reasoning we don't tend to have because we want the answer that we want. And in this way, Kenny is not really different from anyone else. We have this confirmation bias. When you come into discussions with that sort of bias, with that sort of focus, that you're going to only look at information that's going to make you look good and disregard the other information, we can't have productive conversations because we're not open to learning from others. So once again, I want to emphasize this is something that is universal. This is not something that's just done by colorblindness or anti-racists or people in the middle. It's done by all of us. And unless we're willing to learn, we'll be plagued by this confirmation bias and ethnocentrism, and we won't find answers that's going to serve everyone. We're going to find answers to serve ourselves. And that's the danger that we run into.
So our target audience is, somebody in their 20s, which your full-time job is basically individuals in their 20s. And, I think it'd be helpful for our listeners, as you kind of go through people's decades from the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s, what are some of the similarities? What are some of the differences? Bring us into your classroom. How are these conversations going that might surprise our listeners who may have been out of college for a while?
Yeah, so I do think that there is whether it's an age effect or cohort effect, I'm not sure. I think people in the 20s do discuss this differently than people in their 60s and 70s. I think that for people in the 20s and 30s, they're more open to the notion of institutional discrimination than those in their 60s and 70s. And it's understandable, those in their 60s and 70s, the big issue that they grew up with, that they struggled with, that they may have struggled personally with, was treating people the same, the exact same. So individualized type of racism. And so, and they saw plenty of examples of that around. And so I think that they struggle with that more than those in the 20s and 30s, where, they grew up in a society where it is stigmatized to say you'll discriminate against someone based on their race. That to say that is stigmatized in our society today. Those older, it was not stigmatized. Now it's stigmatized today, and they realize that today, but it was not stigmatized them growing up. And so for them, that's where the fight is. For those in 20s and 30s, they're struggling with institutional issues, and what does it mean? And they're more open to struggling and recognizing that than those in the 60s and 70s. My suspicion, I don't have any data on this. I'm not going to just throw out numbers. But my suspicion is that if you're looking at colorblindness, you're going to find that more in the people who are in the 60s and 70s and less in the 20s and 30s. You'll find more anti-racism among the younger than among the older. That's my suspicion. Once again, I don't have any numbers to back that up, but that's my suspicion.
How would you encourage our listeners, especially our younger ones, to maybe engage differently with, the olders and elder, because I think that, the false choice is either I have to correct everything that my parent or grandparent says, or I just have to eat it and not say anything at all. How would you encourage our younger listeners that might be more sensitive to this issue to maybe deal with it in a Christian way?
Yeah, my advice to the young, be my advice to everyone really, is if you're running across someone who you disagree with racially, you should approach them not, and at least initially, not with an attitude of confrontation, but of curiosity. In other words, you should be curious, why does this person believe the way that they believe? And you can be curious in a way where you don't have to feel like I have to believe what they believe, but why does this person believe the way that they believe? How do they come to that conclusion? It makes sense to them. Why does it make sense to me? If you do that, then you'll learn more about who they are. And if you want to persuade people, and this is going to be much more effective than what we do on social media, because people are not persuaded when you insult them. Surprise, surprise, on social media. You persuade people by building rapport. So if you're talking about your relatives, hopefully you already have some rapport with them by acknowledging when they have a good point, by accurately understanding what they have to say. Because if someone disagrees with you on something, let's just say on immigration, and you go right in and say, "Oh, you do this because you don't like Hispanics," and they don't see themselves, and that's not how they see themselves, and it may be true that that's not true about them, then they're not going to be persuaded on your point of view. They're going to say, "Well, you don't even understand where I'm coming from, so why should I listen to you?" So you have to understand accurately where they're coming from. And you have to find areas of agreement. Research has shown that this is how effectively we persuade other people. That building rapport, finding what we agree upon. When they have a good point, that's how you persuade people. And so to get to that point, you got to be curious. You got to be curious about what they really believe, and then you can engage in a conversation that's productive rather than one that's just confrontational. So I don't limit this to the young. I think that all of us can learn how to do this, and I'm a work in progress. I like to say that this is what I do all the time. I wish it was. I wish it was what I did all the time. But I'm trying to be more that way, especially when I discuss some of these issues.
Just the last two questions. I loved how you brought up before. You said, I wrote about race till 2010, and then in 2020, I had to pick it up. And, I think, something that I've heard from some individuals, and I'm going to just try to be as sensitive as possible because I kind of want to hear your response. We've tried in Why God Why to intentionally, 50% of the people that we interview are female or minorities. And, what I've heard, from some of the individuals that I've talked to is, hey, I might be Black or Hispanic. I don't necessarily want to talk about that. I want to talk about something else that I'm passionate about. And, I just think that that's really, really important because even now when I study for a sermon, I'm looking for commentaries that are written by people from different times, different races, and trying to bring that all in. And I guess my suspicion is, and I'd like to hear from you, you took kind of a sabbatical from writing about racism. Help our listeners kind of understand the personal reasons why you made that decision and why you came back to talk about it in 2020.
Yeah, I felt in 2010, I had said everything I had to say about racial issues. I had the book Beyond Racial Gridlock, and I felt pretty good about it, and Transcending Racial Barriers, which was written by a secular academic publisher. So I felt like I could talk to both Christians and non-Christians. It's out there. I felt like if I was going to continue to research, I was just saying the same thing over and over again. I've seen some professors that, one in particular, I won't give his name, has published like 50 books, and they all say the same thing. I did not want to be him. And so I said, I have other things I'm interested in. I was interested in anti-Christian bigotry at that time. I seen some, and it was an area that had not been research, and I saw some evidence of it, and so I studied that. I was interested in atheists. I was interested in cultural progressives. I was interested in other things, and so I said, I've done my share. Someone wants to come and ask me to talk, I'll come talk. But that's not where my focus is. And so that kind of was what drove me, is that I just felt like I didn't have anything new to say. Part of what's bringing me back is that, I made an argument in 2010. I didn't look at the data to support that argument. And so now I want to do that. I want to do research to show that collaborative conversation is a better approach. So in that sense, I have a renewed interest in doing research on racial issues and promoting what I think is a better way. So yeah, I think that's accurate. That I don't want to be just known as a African American guy. There's much more to me than that. I'm not denying that. It's part of my social identity. All fair game. It's more important to me that I'm a child of God. That's more important than me being black. There's other things about me that are important too. The fact I'm a male, the fact that I live in Texas. There are other parts of my social identity as well. So yeah, I think it is good to not just have blacks and women on to talk about race and gender. Yeah.
Well, I appreciate that. Well, we'll close with Jesus, because that's probably a good place to kind of close. So the question we always ask is, and the question we've been asking today that we've really hit direct and indirectly, is why can't we get along with our neighbors of other races? So like a good professor, Aaron and I are going to answer, and then we'll let you close and clean up whatever mess we leave. Does that sound good?
Okay. Sure.
You want to go first, or you want me?
You go this time. That's right.
Oh. I would just give our listeners one piece of advice, whether you're not a Christian or not. If you want to see the vision of loving your neighbor, no matter what, how much money they make, no matter their race, just read the Gospel of Luke. The whole theme of the Gospel of Luke is telling Jesus' story, and it's about the great reversal. So, there's tax collectors that were looked down upon in society. Luke elevates them. There's women who are looked down in society. Luke elevates them, because that's what Jesus is doing. And I think that the step that I would give you is, if you're struggling with how the church is responding or how Christians are responding, the essence of how Jesus lives out this truth of people being created in his image, people who are of different ethnicities, whether they're Gentiles or Jews, it's worked out in this book of Luke. And I just think it's foundational for us to have these conversations. And a lot of what Dr. Yancey has said today, it's foundational of the way Jesus treated people in being created in the image of God. You'll see it on display in that gospel.
Oh, well, yeah, and thanks, Peter, for saying that. I thank you also, George, Dr. Yancey. You're still a professor. I got to call you Dr. Yancey. So, thank you for being part of this conversation today. I think, Peter, it's an important matter and important subject. And you're right. We hit that question indirectly and directly throughout. At the end of the day, I think, Jesus wants us he calls us to love our neighbors, and maybe some of the reason, whether why can't we get along with neighbors of other races? That's the title of the podcast. I think often we often don't get along with neighbors of different, of other differences too. And a lot of that is, I think we don't see each other. We don't listen to each other. And I kind of feel like that's where George is going with a lot of the idea of we need to not just be talking past each other. We need to be listening, seeing, having real conversation. And when you can see people as real people in your life, that's when the relationship can happen, and that's when, if there are wounds, that healing can happen too. So, and I think that Jesus has a role for us as individuals in that, and I think he wants our churches as communities to do something about that too. So, anyways, I think it's an important conversation.
Well, I don't know if I have very much to clean up. It sounds great what y'all are saying. I'll just say this, and this pertains to race, this pertains to a lot of things. One thing guys have worked on me, ever since I come back to race, is the whole idea of other people's image bearers. That to me, that's so revolutionary, because if we get to the point to where people do not have to earn our love and care, that's going to change things. And so we think about that before we put that next retort on social media, or look at someone who disagrees with us politically or racially or something like that, and think about who they are. And we see everyone as either a neighbor or a brother and sister in Christ. To me, that is so revolutionary. And I'll just leave with this. The Samaritans were every bit as hated as any group that we might hate in our society, be it racially, politically, whatever. The Samaritans were hated, and I'm not a theologian, but I've studied enough about that to know there are reasons why they were hated, and a lot of same sort of things that happened to us. How did Jesus treat the Samaritans? Just go back, look at the woman at the well, look at the story of the Good Samaritan. How did Jesus treat the Samaritans? Go and do likewise. And if we did that, then in a post-Christian world, the church would regain a mighty witness. So I'll just live with that, and I think that is is powerful. And thanks for having me on the show.
We're really glad to have you. We want to encourage all of you, from the 2 weeks that this podcast is out, you can use the code WhyGod to buy George's book, Beyond Racial Division. George, if people are looking for you, where else can they find you?
It's georgeyancey.com is easily, but you spell Yancey with an E, Y-A-N-C-E-Y, not C-Y, because that's a different George Yancey. And also, obviously I teach at Baylor. I'm in the Department of Sociology. So if you want to just, look at my Baylor email there, you can do that. So yeah, I am on Facebook and Twitter. So those are the two. I know people are saying, who's on Facebook anymore? Well, I'm there. Like this is us old people. I'm doing Twitter, so I'm doing some of the young people things, but I am on Facebook.
Oh, man. Well, thank you so much for joining us. You can find us at whygodwhypodcast.com. Click the subscribe button. You'll get this podcast and many others. Thank you for joining us.